My goal today is to give you a sense of the structure of the global MPI, which was created by Sabina Alcaire and Maria Santos and colleagues at OFI and UNDP a few years back, based on a methodology developed by Sabina and me. So here it is in a kind of figure form. We see that there are three equally weighted dimensions of health, education, and living standards. Within them, there are indicators. Each indicator within a dimension is equally weighted. So if you look down the list, we see that there are nutrition, which means that someone is considered to be deprived if anyone in the household is malnourished. Child mortality. If a child has died in the household within the last 5 years, a person is considered to be deprived. Years of schooling. If no one in the household has greater than 5 years of schooling. School attendance. If a child who should be in the 8th grade or below is not attending. And then cooking fuel, if they cook with dung, wood, or charcoal. Improved sanitation if it has inadequate sanitation or facilities are shared. Safe drinking water. You're deprived if there's no access to improved water, or they must walk more than 30 minutes to obtain such. Electricity, if there's no access to electricity. Flooring, if the floor is made of dirt or some other natural materials. And finally, assets. If the household does not own more than one of the following assets: radio, telephone, TV, fridge, with the proviso that the household is not deprived if it owns a car or a truck. So that's the basic structure of the dimensions, weights, and indicators for the global MPI. Now let me introduce you to Mario and Olga, who are both over 70 years old and living in the urban outskirts of Cartagena, Colombia. They're the parents of 4 sons and 1 daughter who live independently in the same city. And before they met, they came to Cartagena in 1970 from a rural area on the Caribbean coast. They were fleeing the difficulties of the village, which is how Mario describes it and goes on to describe. My father was a rice farmer. At the time, when I was a child, it was possible to work. But afterwards, during the violence, we were evicted from our land, and the situation changed because we were 12 sons. That is why I arrived in Cartagena, looking for a job. First, I worked as a vegetable seller in the marketplace. After that, I did some different activities. My last job was as a caretaker in the city. In a similar way, and for the same reason, Olga arrived to Cartagena looking for opportunities. She found a job as a housemaid in the city. Although they're living in the poorest area of Cartagena, their hard work has enabled them, their family to achieve a better quality of life than previous generations. In fact, they believe that the current situation is better in terms of public services, like the electricity you can see on the right-hand side, the upper corner, transport from rural areas, education opportunities, and home materials, although, as you can tell from the bottom picture, they still have dirt floor. In terms of income sources, both are unable to work because of health problems. They're receiving non-regular transfers from their sons, either in cash or in kind, and a small tariff from the government for public services. Now, from the individual back to the measure. Who is poor? With the multidimensional MPI, multidimensional poverty indicator index, we see that you're poor if, adding up all the deprivations, you're deprived in at least 33%. Now, if you look at Olga and Mario, we can see they're deprived in a full 1/2 of the indicators. They are MPI poor. We can see how they're MPI poor by looking at the graph below. The shaded indicators show the deprivations they face. They're deprived in 50% of the MPI indicators. Can you see it's years of schooling, nutrition, sanitation, floors, and assets? Indeed, notice that the only living standard indicators without deprivation are related to public services: electricity, cooking fuel, and water provision. In contrast, they show deprivation in indicators related to individual or household capacity to generate wealth. Now let's go from the individual to create the measure of poverty. The multidimensional poverty index is constructed of two indicators. The first one begins with one poor person, adds to the next, and the next, adds up to count the total number of poor persons, and divides by the overall population of the poor. This is the incidence of poverty, or the head count ratio. Likewise, in intensity, you take a look at the individual's breadth of deprivation, the intensity, the 50% for Mario and Olga. Average that across all the poor people, and that becomes your average share of dimensions in which disadvantaged people are deprived. I'll turn it over to my colleague now to tell you what's happening in the world of poverty, multidimensional poverty of the MPI.
Thank you so much, James. So the MPI was first launched in 2010 by the UNDP Human Development Report Office and estimated by OFI, and we have estimated MPI for 117 countries to date using 217 data sets. And also, we have estimated the MPI subnationally for 1,362 subnational regions. Since 2010, there have been quite a number of changes. For example, we have new methodologies of destitution or inequality among the poor, of standard errors, and changes over time with consistent statistics. But there's also a hidden story, which is that the quality of data that underpins the global MPI has improved significantly over this period of nearly 5 years. For example, in 2010 when we launched, we only had all 10 indicators for just over half, 60% of the countries, whereas now it's 84%. And also the harmonization and the quality of those data sets have improved thanks to progress in the demographic and health surveys, multiple indicator and cluster surveys, and others. As a result, the robustness of the global MPI to changes in the weights or in the cutoffs has improved in the past 5 years. So today we are releasing the 5th update, and we have updated data for 37 countries, which is more than we have been able to update in any year prior to this. And those 37 countries cover over 2 billion people. For example, in the African countries that we've updated, we have updated MPI estimations for 43% of the populations covered. In the Arab states, it's 72%. And in East Asia and the Pacific, it's 82%. So for us, it's quite an exciting time because we are able, in a sense, to see new insights into poverty in different regions. Each time we release an MPI, we cover a 10-year window for the analysis. It would be 2004 to 2014 normally, but we have no data from 2004. So it's from 2005 to 2014 that we cover this year. Those 101 countries are home to 5.2 billion people, so 3/4 of the residents of this planet. In terms of the regions, if we look at the major geographic regions, we have very good country coverage in Sub-Saharan Africa, where it's 96% of the population, in South Asia, where it's 94%, and in East Asia and the Pacific, where it's 93% almost. It's a little bit lower in Latin America, where we cover 85% of the population, and much lower in the Europe and Central Asia, and in the Arab states. But at least in 3 major regions, we are able to say something not only about the countries covered, but perhaps about the region as well. So what do we find? First of all, across this population of 101 countries and 5.2 billion people, 30% of them live in the acute multidimensional poverty that James described, because they suffer deprivations in more than 1/3 of the weighted indicators. And that's 1.6 billion people. This is at the national level, and I should say all aggregates that we will share use 2011 population data. But we also break it down subnationally, and we are able to decompose the countries into 884 subnational regions. Of these, the poorest countries are Niger and South Sudan, in which 89 or 91% of the populations are poor. But subnationally, the poorest region is in Chad, it's Salamat. And there are 53 of the regions which have levels of poverty that are above 90% of the citizens of those regions. Now, going beyond the incidence of poverty, let's look at the intensity. In this graphic, the axis lines the countries up from those with the lowest headcount ratio on the left-hand side to the highest countries like Niger and South Sudan on the right. The size of the bubble is the number of poor people in the country, and the color we'll come to later is the level of income of that country. But what you can see on the vertical axis is the average intensity. So what you see is in the green countries with relatively low poverty, average intensity is also low. But in the dark red and in the upper right-hand corner, the poorest countries, the average intensity of poverty for each poor person in that country is much higher. So again, it's drawing importance to going beyond just the numbers or the proportion of poor people to seeing the intensity on average. And then we might want to know, well, where do those poor people live in terms of the level of GDP per capita of the countries? So here we come to the three major groups that we cover in the MPI, the low-income countries, where 14% of the people live, and the lower and upper middle-income countries. What you see in the low-income countries is that the proportion of poor people is doubled. So it's a much higher number of the MPI poor people who live in low-income countries. But you also see that the overwhelming majority of MPI poor people don't live in low-income countries, but rather middle-income countries, which are home to 70% of the MPI poor people. Looking within those aggregates, though, is also very important. So if we take just the upper middle-income countries, which are graded green in this slide, we see that by and large they have quite low MPI levels, with the exception of Namibia, where multidimensional poverty reaches 40%. But if we look at the lower middle-income countries, we see really quite a gradation from Ukraine or Syria with quite low levels of poverty to South Sudan, which was middle-income, lower middle-income country. And so really there is the entire spectrum in this band of levels of GDP per capita. And similarly, when we go to low-income countries, we also see a band, which is in a sense a more positive story, because we see countries like Tajikistan, which have quite low levels of multidimensional poverty, although their GDP per capita is also low. They have been able to control acute multidimensional poverty through proactive social policies. And finally, we might want to look at how multidimensional poverty corresponds to income poverty. And the most common global measure of income poverty is the $25 a day measure published by the World Bank. So these are the same countries stacked in the same order, with the countries with the highest incidence on the right, and the height of the beige bar indicates the percentage of people who are MPI poor in those countries. The black dots represent the percentage of people who are income poor by the $25 a day measure. And you see, therefore, that there is quite a gradation, with countries like Chad or Niger or Ethiopia having much lower levels of income poverty, the black dots on the far right, and other countries having much higher levels, the black dots floating high above the MPI headcount ratios. And so we argue that for that reason, there is a need to complement an indicator of extreme income poverty with an indicator of acute multidimensional poverty in order to have a higher visibility into who is poor and how to fight their poverty. I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague Christoph to share a little bit more about MPI in different countries, regions.
So, we sometimes ask how the global MPI differs from other commonly used indices. And in order to investigate this question, we have compared the global MPI to other indices like the Human Development Index, the Global Peace Index, the Ease of Doing Business Index, and the Fragile State Index. And what we found is that there is variation in the strength of the association between the indices. I will present the results of the comparison shortly for the Human Development Index and the Global Peace Index. The MPI has been reported alongside the HDI tables since 2010. Both indices have the same dimensions. They focus on health, education, and the standard of living, but the indices capture different concepts. So the Human Development Index measures well-being, the MPI measures poverty. Also, their data sources differ. In the case of the Human Development Index, the indicators are national averages and come from different data sources. The MPI, in contrast, measures poverty by looking at the joint deprivations of the individuals. And in order to get an idea of the deprivation profiles, the MPI uses microdata surveys that contain information on each of the indicators. And these structures then provide different abilities. So the Human Development Index is available at the national level. The global MPI has a national value, but can also be decomposed by regions, groups, and/or dimensions. So both indices differ. Empirically, they are related in that lower Human Development Index values usually go with higher multidimensional poverty. Nonetheless, and this is what the bigger of the two pie charts shows, around 60% of all multidimensional poor actually live in countries that are ranked as having medium or high human development. Thus, acute multidimensional poverty is actually not restricted to countries that have low human development only. So next, let us just take a quick look at the association between the global MPI and the Global Peace Index. The Global Peace Index intends to measure a country's relative peacefulness and is calculated by the Institute for Economics and Peace. So the GPI combines information on three different topics: the level of security and safety in a specific society, information on domestic and international conflicts, and the degree of militarization. So we divided all countries on the GPI into five groups of equal size based on the relative position on the ranking. So the first group has the most peaceful countries, and the last group the least peaceful countries, according to the GPI. We then compared this categorization to the countries for which we have MPI estimates as well. So the findings, firstly, when looking at the groups, we find that 70% of all multidimensional poor actually live in countries that are the least peaceful countries. So countries belonging to the least peaceful category show both high incidence and high intensity of poverty. However, as we count the countries, nearly 50% of our population actually lives in this category. But countries in the second worst category actually have the lowest average multidimensional poverty index of all categories. So in the graph shows the distribution of the global MPI and the Global Peace Index. So countries in the dark red at the right side of the graph are the least peaceful countries, while countries on the left are more peaceful. Similarly, countries at the top have high MPI, while countries at the bottom have lower MPI. So what the graph shows, it's actually quite difficult to spot a strong systematic association between the two indices. So what we have countries that have low, more peaceful, so they are on the left, but at the same time they have high multidimensional poverty, like Sierra Leone or Burkina Faso. At the same time, we find countries that are less peaceful but have low multidimensional poverty, like Iraq. So in the end, when looking at the country level, the association between the two indices is quite low. For the other indices, we also found rather weak associations, so people who are more interested in this kind of comparison, you can read more about it in our policy brief, which you will find in the entrance hall.
Thank you, Christoph. So as Sabine and James explained, the Multidimensional Poverty Index combines information on intensity and incidence of poverty. And these components are important in order to characterize what poverty is like around the different regions of the world. So on the left-hand side chart, we know that we see that the yellow bar shows there it is. The yellow bar shows, or beige bar shows a higher incidence in sub-Saharan Africa, and this is the region with the highest incidence of all. And we know also that a third of the multidimensionally poor people around the globe live in that region. Incidence in South Asia is as well very high, as more than half of the multidimensionally poor people around the globe live in that area. We would see as well that incidence of poverty is lower in Arab countries, indicated by the black line on the left-hand side. But if we focus then on intensity of poverty in the right-hand side chart, we see that the intensity is quite similar in between the Arab states and South Asia, which indicates that some countries that have high acute poverty levels in the Arab regions, such as Somalia and Sudan, are contributing to this average intensity of poverty to be quite high in that region. And for the segregation analysis is one of the most appealing features of the index in order to better inform public policy that can tackle poverty in a better way. So as Christophe explained, the multidimensional poverty index can be broken down into its components. In this chart, we see the regions of the world, and the gray bar at the left of each of the boxes indicates the headcount ratio or the incidence of poverty in each of the regions. Our analysis shows that most of the multidimensionally poor people are deprived in cooking fuel, as is indicated by the dark green bar in each of the boxes. And also sanitation deprivations are quite acute in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. But effective policies to fight poverty should consider an intersectoral approach. And this would mean, for instance, that in South Asia, we should focus as well on deprivations in terms of nutrition, which are the highest in comparison to other regions in South Asia. And deprivations in terms of drinking water, indicated by one of the light green bars in the Arab states, is higher, comparatively speaking, to the deprivation space in the same indicator, drinking water in South Asia. So this is the type of characterization of poverty that policymakers can have. But even further, apart from what the complexity that we see in different regions of the world, we can also zoom into different countries and analyze subnational regions. So for instance, a policymaker that is looking at the index of multidimensional poverty index in Nigeria will actually notice the important divide between the north and south of the country in terms of the index, and this could even be broken down further into the components of this index, each of the indicators and its contribution to the index, or even further and combine both analyses in which each of the regions has different poverty profile. So the poorest regions of Nigeria are at the left side of this graph, and you can see that the composition of poverty it's more or less equally divided between the different dimensions, but this composition changes as we move along the axis to the wealthiest regions of Nigeria. So this is all this data is available at the DataBank online, and you can access it on the office webpage. I had more examples, but I would like now to leave some time for my colleague Yang Yang, who will present specifically the China case study for data take. Thank you.
Thank you, Priscilla. Good afternoon, everyone. Now I will present a case study in China using the global MPI method. Firstly, we find that China's global NPI is very low. According to our calculations, we find that only 5.5% of people were NPI poor in China. However, it also affects almost 75 million people in China. And among these poor people, we find that they are experiencing an average death ratio of 40.9%. And this leads to a very low result of China's global MPI, which is 0.023. I'll show you this graph, and it's the MPI values in 101 countries, and we can see that China is here. It shows that China's global MPI is not that high. As Sabina and James has already mentioned that AF methodology will help us better understand what exactly poverty is like. So let's go inside China's global MPI. I will talk about three things during the next few minutes. The first thing is who is poor, and second is how are they poor, and third is what is the relationship between the income poor and MPI poor. So the first question, who is poor? If we decompose the MPI into different subgroups, we can answer this question. Basically, we find that people who are living in the less developed regions are more poor in China. For example, in this graph, we can see that people who are living in the rural areas or the western regions are poorer than the people who are living in the other regions. And also, they are poorer than the national level. And also, we find that households with these characters are more likely to be poor. For example, the households where the head has no education are more likely to be poor. Or the household size is more than 5 members are more likely to be poor. Or the households who are receiving the government tax transfers are more likely to be poor. Okay, the next question. How are they poor? To answer these questions, we need to better understand what kind of debt ratios are higher among poor people. And this can be breaking the MPI down into different indicators. I will show you this graph. It presents the percentage of people who are poor and deprived. Simply speaking, the higher number, the higher debt ratios among poor people. And we can see that the debt ratios in nutrition, in years of schooling, in school attendance, and in cooking field contributes most to the poverty in China. And the last question, what is the relationship between the income poor and MPI poor? Based on our data set, we use the China's rural poverty line, get 20.6% of people who are income poor. And can you still remember the percentage of people who are MPI poor? Yes, it's 5.5%. Thank you. And we might expect that all these 5.5% of the population belongs to the set of income poor. However, it's not the case. When we see the overlap, we find only 1.6%, which means that less than 2% of people who are poor in both income poor and MPI poor. This is quite unexpected. But it still shows that MPI would be a good complementary measure for the income poverty. Thank you. And now Sabina will give some introductions to the restitution.
Thank you so much, Yang. So to close, I want to present some results on a subset of the MPI poor who not only experience acute multidimensional poverty, but an even more stringent condition which we call destitution. We implement a measure of destitution now for 82 countries, which are home to 1.5 of the 1.6 billion MPI poor people that we covered this year. In the destitution measure, they're the same 10 indicators as the global MPI. They are the same weights, and we still use the poverty cutoff that each poor person, in this case each destitute person, is deprived in 1/3 of the weighted indicators. But what we change are the deprivation cutoffs, which we can affect for 8 of the 10 indicators. We leave electricity and fluorine unchanged. So now the measure reflects the following indicator definitions. You are deprived in the destitution indicator if nobody has completed 1 year of schooling in your household, or if a child is out of primary school, or if somebody in the household is in severe malnutrition, severely malnourished, or if you have lost 2 or more children. You're deprived if you don't have any form of sanitation facility and so use open defecation. If you have to walk more than 45 minutes to obtain safe drinking water. And if you only cook with dung or wood. And finally, you're deprived in assets if you don't even have a mobile phone or radio. When we built this indicator for destitution, we hoped that we would find nobody inside, especially because to be destitute, you have to experience 1/3 of the weighted deprivations that we've constructed. But actually, we find that half of the MPI poor people, nearly 50%, are destitute across these 82 countries. The headcount ratios of people who are destitute are signified by the dark maroon bars in this chart. And what you see is that in the less poor countries, the proportion of MPI poor who are destitute is relatively low. But as you go to the high poverty countries, more than half of the MPI poor people experience this condition of destitution. So where do they live? We actually find that of the 736 million people identified as destitute across these countries, 92% of them live in South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. I must acknowledge that India's data are out of date. India's last survey from which we can construct a global MPI was 2005-06. And so we hope that there will shortly be up-to-date data for India, and that will affect the destitution and the MPI figures. But here's also another puzzle. We would have expected that the destitute people primarily live in low-income countries. But I don't know if you remember that we found that 70% of the MPI poor people lived in middle-income countries. It's even higher for destitution, with 71% of the destitutes living in middle-income countries, which shows that even countries with sufficient economic resources to control these levels of destitution have not done so, meaning that we do need explicit policy measures to address them. Furthermore, we find that of those indicators that I named, each one of them is contributing to destitution. To give you only a few examples, of the 736 million people who are destitute, 39% of them live in households with no more than 1 year of schooling. 49% of them have somebody at home with severe malnutrition. A quarter of them have no assets and no toilet. So why do we continue to profile destitution? And I know it's not a happy subject. But first of all, it seems that at least by this definition, it is unquestionably a kind of extreme poverty. But it's not the same as income poverty. For example, take the case of Chad. In Chad, 66% of people are destitute, but only 37% are poor by the $1.25 a day. And so there's a danger that we could be in a situation where we eradicate poverty as measured by the $1.25 a day measure, but still are left with a number of people in this condition of destitution. Indeed, by very, very modest assumptions, there are at least 100 million such people. And so we argue that, again, we need to measure both kinds of extreme poverty in order to be able to fight both of them. So that's an overview of some of our results for the global MPI this year. And I'd like to stress again that what my colleagues have already said, that the MPI is like a high-resolution lens. We know that 30% of people are MPI poor in the countries covered. That's 1.6 billion people. We know national averages for 101 countries. But we can then zoom in subnationally to see the levels of poverty, of incidence and intensity, and pull it apart to see the composition by different subnational regions, or by ethnic groups, or by rural and urban areas, and other population groups by which the data can be decomposed. And so you can zoom in and see more. And I think it's this feature which has generated a great deal of interest in multidimensional poverty as a tool not just to measure poverty, but to inform and energize policies to fight it. So for example, there are a number of countries that now use national MPIs with different indicators and cutoffs to measure their official poverty statistics. For example, Chile, Mexico, Colombia, and Bhutan all have MPIs as national statistics, as does Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, or the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil. And a number of these countries have gathered together in a multidimensional poverty peer network that was launched here a couple years ago with President Santos and Amartya Sen, and has met every year and also organized different side events at the General Assembly and Statistics Commission. And these countries are trying to help one another to explore and design better ways to confront poverty in all its dimensions. They have called, therefore, for an improvement in national MPIs, but also for some consideration of the global MPI to be adopted as an indicator within the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. As you may know, the Sustainable Development Goals have a target to reduce poverty in all its dimensions. And this need to look at multidimensional poverty has echoed through various of the SDG documents. And so the hope is that in the future reports there might continue to be a global measure of acute multidimensional poverty. And also, as Yang Yang suggested, perhaps measures of moderate poverty that would be more appropriate for countries like China, or in Latin America, or in the Arab states, or in Europe and Central Asia. So that's, in a sense, what we have tried to pull together this year. For more information, all of these data and graphics are available on our website, where we have additional qualitative studies for the kind of person who really wants to know the human beings besides the numbers. There are policy briefings, a special one on China and on destitution. And we have country briefings if you want to go into depth on the country that you study in particular. And there's an interactive DataBank if you want to pull out particular maps for your own slides or download particular sets of data. And of course, if you like Excel, we have all of the data available in that format. It leaves me only then to thank from my heart the MPI team. This is a product of a collaboration with UNDP's Human Development Report Office. We're grateful to them, the DHS and MIX and PAPFAM teams who have given us use and advice regarding their surveys. To many different colleagues, including the communications team, Claire and Patty, who've been stellar in helping us to try to pull this together in a non-academic format, and to the many people who helped to compute the global MPI. And I'd like to acknowledge Gisela Robles Aguilar as being the leader of this year's global MPI computations. So thank you very much. We look forward to our continuing conversations and to taking this work forward.
Book. We now have two discussants. First, Celine Jahan, who's the Director of the Human Development Report Office in UNDP. This office has really launched the global MPI in a way with Sabina, and is the first institution to have published the global MPI, and I congratulate them for that. And Celine will now give a comment.
Thank you, Francis. First of all, thanks to OFI for inviting me to this particular event. And I think a congratulation is in order for updating the MPI results, as well as for publishing a beautiful book, which is lying outside of this room. And we also acknowledge the leadership of Sabina and James in the whole initiative that have been taken and that have been rooted so far. Let me start with three initial observations. First, from the Human Development Report Office side, we feel very privileged and honored to be a collaborator in this intellectual enterprise. I think this is the 25th year of the emergence of the concept of human development, and this is the 5th year for the publication of the MPI. So we have lots to celebrate together, and we see you as a collaborator in the work that we have been doing for the last few years. Second, I think sitting in New York or sitting in Oxford, it's not always possible to assess the impacts that this particular approach and the MPI have had and are having at the country. Some results have been presented. I have been in Morocco in recent times. I think the excitement of finding an alternative to quote-unquote the income poverty line is very much there. So countries are looking for alternatives. Countries are experimenting with different kind of approaches, and MPI has provided them with a means to explore those things. So the excitement, the interest of countries in having MPI as a kind of a measure for multidimensional poverty is very much there. And third, I think the OFI and the MPI initiative has evolved, has developed over the years. I mean, we know that in 2010, there are only 60% of the countries which have had all 10 indicators. Now we have 84% of the countries which have had all the indicators. That's quite an achievement. In terms of the data, if I'm not mistaken, in 2010, most of the data were from 2008. Now we have data which are more recent. So it's not only the country coverage with all the indicators, but I think the richness of the data as well as the up-to-date data are at the very center of the MPI measurements. The presentations that we have heard so far, I think it is rich, it's diverse. So I think it's very difficult to reflect in 5 or 10 minutes on the richness, breadth, the depth of the work and the presentations that we have heard on the MPI. I will just limit myself to 5 observations. The first one is that there are at least 13 countries where the MPI or the value of the MPI has been found to be twice that of income poverty. Now, it basically shows that income poverty is sometimes very limited and doesn't give us the kind of the multidimensional approach that one needs to look at the multidimensionality of poverty. Income is not the sum total of human lives, and the lack of income cannot be the sum total of human population. So therefore, looking at the multidimensional poverty gives us that kind of the breadth. If I can paraphrase Mahbubul Haq, the MPI may be as vulgar as income poverty income ratio, but it is not as blind as to the broader dimensions of human population. The second observation is that we have heard that 7 in every 10 MPI poor people live in middle-income countries. 3 in every 5 of MPI poor people do not live in failed states. Now, these have implications particularly for the post-2015 development agenda as well as the sustainable development goals. Because often you hear people say that MDGs were for the poor people, and since we have reduced poverty and achieved the goal of halving poverty thanks to China, therefore we now can talk about the middle-income countries and sustainable development. But extreme poverty itself is still a problem, and it is more of a problem in middle-income countries than in low-income countries. Therefore, whatever SDGs we choose, whatever indicator we go for, we cannot avoid the whole issue of multidimensional poverty and extreme poverty through multidimensional lens as the kind of the anchor for the sustainable development goals. The third observation that I would like to make that yes, we have talked about the coverage of the countries. We have talked about 1.6 billion people who are MPI poor. But for me, the more interesting things are the disaggregation of the data and the results. We have disaggregated it for 884 subnational levels, because when you disaggregate it in terms of regions, in terms of ethnicity or race, or in terms of men and women, that unmasks a lot of the averages that we sometimes try to hide the pockets of deprivation, the degree of deprivation. And we of course know the well-known joke about the average, that half of your body may be in the oven, the other half may be in the refrigerator, and on average you'll be comfortable. So by unmasking that kind of deprivation, I think that gives a lot of insights to the policymakers in terms of resource allocation, in terms of policy choices, in terms of the instruments that they are going to use for those kind of things. My fourth point is, this particular study has also looked at destitution. And Sabina has referred destitution as extreme poverty. For me, destitution is dispossession. It is dispossession of income, dispossession of wealth, dispossession of social services, dispossession of human dignity. So therefore, when we talk about that half of the MPI poor are destitutes, and 739 million people actually live in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa who are destitutes. These are also the people who would be in poverty on an intergenerational basis. They are at the bottom of the pit. And it will be very difficult to get them out of that destitution. The national government policies sometimes don't reach them. The international organizations don't reach them. Even the civil society, the NGOs, the activities also don't reach them. So therefore, one cannot talk about reducing poverty, eliminating poverty, unless you actually look at the destitution aspect of it, or the dispossessed people. My final point are basically a couple of suggestions as we move forward in terms of the research topics and things like that. One is a simple one, and I will start with the simple one. Often we have seen that we are comparing MPI poor with poverty by $1.25 a day. 1.25 PPP a day, and the numbers actually don't mean anything to me. Absolutely nothing. So I would rather say, as we have seen in the case of China, to compare the MPI and the incidence of MPI poverty with that of national poverty. I think that would make more sense. The second suggestion I put on the table is that, yes, we have disaggregated our MPI in terms of all rural and urban areas, as well as more than 800 subnational levels. I would urge that the future research should go whether we can also disaggregate them in terms of ethnicity, in terms of race, if possible in terms of women and men. So rather than only talking about regions or administrative units or rural-urban divide, if we can really disaggregate them in terms of those dimensions, that would provide a lot of insights, not only from the economic point of view, but also from social and political point of view. My third suggestion would be, it may be useful to explore at least whether we can do some MPI with some other indicators maybe for the developed countries. Because poverty nowadays is not only a developing country phenomenon. If there is a north in the south, there's also a south in the north. So therefore I think as a future research agenda, it would be quite useful if we try to have some kind of a multidimensional poverty index for the developed countries. And that would also provide the kind of the deprivations that are existent in those kind of countries. Finally, the whole MPI exercise and the work that OFI has been doing, for me this is work in progress. And every day we are learning something. There are attempts to define the methodology. There are attempts to get more data and everything. From the Human Development Report side, we want to collaborate with you. We look forward to work with you so that we can be the kind of the co-passengers in the intellectual enterprise that we have started together. Thank you.
Very much, Salim. We now have Max Rosen from the James Martin Fellow in Economic Modelling at the Institute for New Economic Thinking at the St James Martin School. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for inviting me to speak about human development in context of the multidimensional poverty measures. I thought it would be interesting to give some historical dynamic perspective on what is happening to poverty. And I very much agree with the idea or the basic concept of OFI to have a broad range of measures and to not only look at income but to look at different dimensions of deprivation and see what is happening in each of these aspects. And what I prepared is a talk on some of these dimensions over the very long run. I chose of each of these three dimensions of poverty, I chose one indicator. Out of the health dimension, I want to look at child mortality over the long run. From the education dimension, I want to look at schooling. And from the living standards, I want to look at cooking fuel and indoor air pollution, which is the negative consequence of using these coal, charcoal, and wood as cooking fuels. To start with, let's have a look at child mortality, and it is really a historical perspective. We go back very far. The earliest estimates on child mortality reach back to the beginning of the 19th century, 1800. It's shown here. It's a bit of an unusual graph, so I guess I explain what you actually see here. On the x-axis, you see the cumulative share of the world population, and then on the y-axis, all of the countries of the world are ordered descending by their child mortality rate. So for each country, you see the share that it makes up for the cumulative share of the world population. So Yemen and India are the countries back then with the highest child mortality rate. Child mortality is child dying before reaching the age of 5. And back in the day, more than every second child died before reaching the age of 5. And then further down the red line, you see countries with slightly better child mortality. China having a child mortality of just about 14%, and then the best of countries, Belgium, like the modern borders, current borders, had a child mortality around a third, so every third child died in the very best of countries 250 years ago. And now we can move forward and switch to the 1950s, and the second line shows how child mortality changed until then. On the very left, countries are still stuck in very bad health, around 33% in the worst of countries. And then on the very right, some of the richer countries improved their health very significantly and reached child mortality levels of less than 10%. And you see a world that's clearly divided in the developing world on the very left and richer developed world on the very right with better health. And now the last available data for 2013 shows the change that happened since then. Child mortality on average came down to 3.4%, starting from 43% 215 years ago. and some countries made very rapid improvement. You can follow some of the countries through the 3 years. For example, if you look at Iran, one of the countries with the worst child mortality in 1800 of more than 50%, reduced it down to maybe 5 or 6%. But still some countries, and we've heard a lot about this, are still suffering from very poor health. Angola is now the country with the highest child mortality of just 17%. So we definitely made some progress and things are moving in the right direction, but there's still a lot of work to be done and definitely no reason for complacency there. A second aspect is as cooking fuel. It was mentioned before that the use of wood, crop residues, dung, charcoal and coal is responsible for indoor air pollution, so the thick smoke is filling the huts if particularly women and children are at home in the huts, and then cause diseases like pneumonia, stroke, heart diseases, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and also lung cancer. And this is a very serious problem in the world still. Every year, 4.3 million people die due to indoor air pollution. To put this in perspective, this is 45 times the annual number of deaths due to natural catastrophes. And it's also more than 2 times the number of deaths due to AIDS. So it is a very serious problem, maybe a problem that less often makes the headlines. So I'm very happy that OFI takes it into account in the Multidimensional Poverty Index. There's also some data on the change of using solid fuels. I visualized it here on this chart. In the middle, the blue line shows the world average, down from 62% in 1980 to now 41%. So it is going in the right direction, but it's still very, very high. And if you look at the world region disaggregation, you see that progress in Africa is pretty slow, and it is better in Southeast Asia, a region that we heard before was making rapid progress in the last decades. Like one other aspect that I should mention here is that these figures only allow you to look at each of these individual measures in the aggregate on the country level or on the world region level, while the OFI data has the great advantage of aggregating it on the household level, and you have information what is happening within the households, which is not possible for these historical estimates. And a third aspect, education, also again a very long-term perspective on the last 200 years. Now we're looking at the share of the population older than 15 that attended some kind of formal education. And back in the middle of the 19th century, Western Europe and the Western offshoots, this is North America and also Australia and New Zealand, they had more than half of their population already in some kind of formal education. Eastern Europe was then catching up very rapidly over the first half of the 20th century, and all of these regions reaching close to 100% or 100%. East Asia, Latin America followed and had this more slow but consistent increase over the last 115 years. And then the poorest world regions started with the even longer lag, but over the second half of the 20th century, education also improved in Africa and Asia. And what are the results of that? That's the global average. What are the results of that? I chose to look at one indicator here, the world literacy rate as an outcome of education. It rose from 12% back in the beginning of the 19th century. These are, of course, like historical estimates with considerable uncertainty around it, to more than 50% in 1970, and today in the latest data it rose to 83%. And before we go into the break, I think some optimistic note on this discussion on poverty. If you disaggregate the figures on literacy rate, you get the following picture. So on average, the world has a literacy rate of 83%. This is the literacy rate by country for the old generations, so 65 years and older. You see that in much of Africa and also South Asia and some of the Arabic states, literacy rates are just 30% or even lower. Now we can also look at this measure for the young generation, and then the world has changed quite dramatically. If you look at the map above, particularly in South Asia and also in the Arab states, we've seen a rapid improvement of literacy, and in this way I think we can have some kind of forecast into the future without having any fancy econometrics or models behind it. The people that are now 15 to 24 will be 55 to 64 in 40 years from now, and should make us optimistic that we can further reduce poverty in the coming decades.
Thank you very much for some excellent comments, and I'm glad that the Institute of Modelling does such nice, straightforward stuff. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, panel. Thank you very much, audience. An excellent discussion. We'll now have